Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at our very exciting webinar, Indigenous Knowledge as Evidence for Environmental Decision-Making. This is our third webinar in our partnership with the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Informed Conservation. You can check out our previous webinars on the Canadian Science Publishing YouTube channel. I'm Albana. I'm a journal development specialist at Canadian Science Publishing, and I'm also joined by fellow webinar co-organizer Hilary Belleville, and who will be moderating the chat today, and technical support by content marketing specialist Rebecca Michaels-Walker. Canadian Science Publishing recognizes and respects the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples across the lands and in Canada and worldwide, on whose territories we and our research contributors are privileged to work, live, and learn on. We commit to dismantling structures in science publishing that have harmed Indigenous peoples, lands, and knowledges, and to honor the expertise of Indigenous knowledge keepers, past, present, and emerging, in pursuit of a just and sustainable future for all. We gratefully acknowledge the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation, on whose unceded and unsurrendered territory our Ottawa head office is located and where I'm joining from today. I invite you all to let us know where you're joining in from in the chat and recognizing treaties where applicable so we can celebrate the diverse lands that we call home. A bit about Canadian Science Publishing. We are an independent, not-for-profit publisher who places researchers at the heart of our operations. Research-led and community-focused, we work together to move research forward. We publish some of Canada's longest-running and most respected scientific journals, which were initiated by Canada's National Research Council many years ago. We are committed to advancing excellence in scientific journal publishing through openness, ethics, and collaboration, and have active partnership through over 35 scholarly societies and organizations, including our proud partnership with the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Informed Conservation. Through this partnership, we will empower researchers and decision makers, create a community of practice related to evidence synthesis and use, and offer tangible methods and resources to enable evidence-informed decision-making, policy, and practice in Canada and beyond. I'd like to pass the mic over to our webinar moderator today, the director of the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Informed Conservation, Dr. Steve Cook. Take it away, Steve.
Thanks, Albana. Hey, friends, colleagues, really good to see you. I don't know if you're paying attention at the bottom there. The number of participants, we're at about 378 as of this second, with more continuing to join. I'm keeping my eye on that chat, and we've got folks tuning in from across Turtle Island. I also saw somebody from South Africa, from Nepal, so really quite an international group joining us here today. And for me, I don't think that's surprising given the importance of this topic. There's also a number of challenges associated with this. So I think we can all agree that when it comes to environmental decision making, we all want the best evidence at the table. And for a long time, when we say best, we've sort of assumed that meant peer-reviewed Western science. And we're learning more and more that doing that really closes the door to other knowledge systems that have a lot to offer. But more importantly, it also really makes it challenging to on our pathway to reconciliation and ensuring that Indigenous voices, Indigenous knowledge are able to thrive and to engage with these decision-making processes in ways that make sense to those groups. So that is essentially the background and basis for today. I'm thrilled to be able to share that we have three amazing panelists. We've got Dr. Alison Menzies, a fairly early career scholar from the University of Calgary. We've got Dr. Stephen Alexander from Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and Dr. Deborah McGregor from the University of Calgary. So what we're going to do is I've got a series of questions that I will be using to guide our panelists through a series of discussions. When I come to them the very first time in the order that I just briefly introduced them, they're going to introduce themselves a little bit more fully. And then what we'll do is work through, as I said, a series of questions, but we'd love to hear your questions as well. So there, in addition to the chat, there's a Q&A function. So if you have a question, you can throw it in there. We will do our best to get to it, but with 375 plus participants, I can guarantee you we're not going to get to all of them. In many ways, today is a conversation starter. These conversations will continue around boardroom tables. They will continue around water coolers. They will continue around feasts. And they will continue in the pages of the CSP journals, where journals like Facets have really established themselves as a place for having discussions about Indigenous knowledge systems and how they interface with Western knowledge systems and environmental decision making. So with that, I would like to begin with the first question. So I'll read the first question, and that is as follows. What does it look like in practice to meaningfully and respectfully engage with and bring Indigenous knowledge together with other Western scientific with other forms of evidence, such as Western scientific evidence? And so we'll go in the order that I indicated. So first of all, Dr. Menzies.
Hi, thanks. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I'm kind of glad we can't see all the 400 squares in front of us, but I'm Ali Menzies and I am at the University of Calgary. I've been here for about 2 years now. And so I'm calling in from Treaty 7, which is now where I live. I'm originally from Manitoba, and that's kind of, to me, where I still call home. But I was born and raised in Treaty 2 territory in the prairies, and still work a lot in those spaces, and my family's there, and that's really the place that shaped kind of who I am and how I relate to the environment and knowledges and all of these different things. And mostly I work on wildlife, community-based monitoring, conservation, a lot in the context of culturally important species like moose and soon to be geese and maybe bison as well. And my journey has been largely academic, well, solely academic, I would say. And so my responses to these questions are a little bit more from my experience being on the periphery or on the outside from a lot of processes that require evidence synthesis, especially if we're talking about, at the government and things like that. And so when I was looking over the questions, the things I identified first were just more questions and challenges. So I'm going to try to answer some of the questions, but also maybe talk a little bit about too, like where I see the challenges in here. Especially this first question, what does it look like in practice? I think whenever we start a question with that, there's no solid answer as far as I am concerned. There are some like suggestions, but I think it's pretty hard to come to like one solid answer of how do we do this in practice? And so when thinking about evidence synthesis and bringing together Indigenous knowledge and Western scientific evidence, I think we're still at a place where there's this kind of paradox of the very process of synthesizing evidence is still pretty harmful and can lead to misuse of different knowledges. And I think so it's a pretty tough question to answer in terms of how does this work? And I think one of the reasons is because I think a lot of this process and these protocols are designed before community or Indigenous people even get involved. And so the process itself and the protocols that are used are fairly Western scientific, and the idea of even meta-analyses and things like that go beyond, I guess, what I think Indigenous knowledge and science is for, which is usually, knowledge and survival of a single place, a single community. Not to say it's not useful. I think it's very useful to have conversations across places and across contexts and knowledge systems. But I think two of the biggest issues, I think, are these protocols that are designed kind of without community involved, and also processes that are really not transparent of, when knowledge is being used, how, where, why. And so I think I would say meaningfully bringing knowledges together means engagement at every phase, even before the idea and the protocols are brought together, but also having these processes be transparent so that it's evident what this knowledge is being brought together for and why. And particularly being someone who's never worked in government or beyond academia, a lot of these processes are not transparent. And so having knowledge being synthesized for something bigger is a little bit scary or uncertain because it's not really clear why they're being brought together. I think I could go on for a lot longer, but I might just pass it off to Dr. Alexander, I think was next on the list.
Indeed,
And
indeed.
maybe
And
I'll come back to
that
some of my points later.
that theme of need for sort of bespoke processes, I think, is one we might come back to. So thank you. Dr. Alexander.
Thanks so much, and thanks for the invitation. Really humbled to be joining Dr. Menzies and McGregor on this panel today. As was introduced, my name is Steve Alexander. I'm section head of the Reconciliation Through Science unit here at Fisheries Oceans Canada. We're a small but mighty team that really works to support and advance reconciliation and look towards how can we transform the way we do our science to be more inclusive and to support self-determination in our research and monitoring practices. I'm joining you today from the homelands of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples, where I live, work, play, and raise my two young boys to be future stewards of these lands and waters. I myself was born and raised in the Mohawk and Mohegan territory down in northern New York. It's where I first spent my days exploring the natural world, the hillsides and the woods, and creating my own deep connection to place. I was a nerd and had a topographic map up in my youth bedroom, or my boyhood bedroom, because I just loved looking at maps and seeing all of the nuances of the landscape that I would go and explore after school. So I am a settler, an immigrant, an ally, and a collaborator. And this is such an important question, and I really loved how Ali kicked us off around the importance of protocols. I was thinking about protocols and the importance of following community protocols, and also about transparency. One of the other things I was thinking about was, even as a starting point, is when we're talking about bringing Indigenous and Western sciences together in the context of evidence synthesis, what is the scale, scope, and purpose? It's going to look slightly different. Are we talking about a lake, a bay, a field, an ecosystem, or a continent? I was just reminded of the North American Biodiversity and Climate Change Assessment that is taking place right now. Very different scales of the kinds of evidence synthesis processes that take place. And then, the scope or the purpose, the for what. So important to think about all of those and how those inform the kinds of protocols, the kinds of processes that we might explore and need to do things differently. But across those, some of the things that really stood out to me was, how are we, so how am I, particularly as a non-Indigenous practitioner, how am I doing the groundwork or the prep work, right? So, the focus on reflexivity and positionality, how am I coming to that space, to that place, to be in dialogue, to really focus on the collective, the collaborative, working in partnership, recognizing the importance of context, and the importance of context throughout that process, and what does that look like from the kinds of questions that are being asked to the approaches. And I love this idea of bespoke approaches, adjusting and adapting, looking to do evidence synthesis differently, and kind of co-creating that process, being more transparent about it, and having a process that really centers relationships and is guided by respect for everyone who is taking part in that. And then, the last point I'll emphasize that I was thinking about this morning is, when we're talking about evidence synthesis and a recognition and acknowledgement that evidence comes in many different forms. And so having an approach that is respectful, culturally grounded, we also have to think about like the for what. And Max Lieberman, in their work, Pollution and Colonialism, Pollution is Colonialism, talks about generalizability and universalism, and the importance of not conflating them, which I think was really helpful when we think about evidence synthesis. And they talk about the importance that, generalizability is about commonality, shared characteristics, and overlap. So things can generalize, but still be place-based and have differences despite those similarities. And so for me, I think keeping that in mind as we think about these evidence synthesis processes, working across multiple ways of knowing and creating shared spaces for that knowledge synthesis. Lots of tongue twisters in there. Thanks. I'll pause there for now.
Thanks so much, Stephen. That's great. And perhaps if you have a moment, you can share a link to Max's scholarship in the chat there, just help people connect. Dr. McGregor, over to you.
Thank you. So it's an honor to be here on this panel and just really enjoying the chat and seeing where people are from, including from New Zealand. I'm like, what time is it there? So yeah, so happy to be here. So this is actually a topic like at the moment I'm thinking a lot about. Like right now, I'm one of the lead authors for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and literally responding to the peer review comments for the next iteration of the report. And this is one of the big questions on how diverse knowledge systems are, that like there's all these codes and it changed. I've been doing this for 4 decades, and the kind of way that we pose these questions and kind of what all the rage is at the moment is has changed over time. Anyway, that's all the rage right now is diverse knowledge systems and co-production. So I'm Deb McGregor, and I'm Anishinaabe from Whitefish River First Nation. So and live in the Great Lakes. So even though I'm at the University of Calgary, I'm still, for the most part, still in the East, because right now that's where the research relationships are. And I think in answering that question, those relationships are really important. I'm not the kind of person who plops myself somewhere and says, "Hey, who wants to do what I do?" Like that's not how I approach. That's not how I approach what I do. But I just wanted to highlight. So I have been involved in assessments and looking at evidence for some time, being involved in Canada's climate assessment processes previously and now in this round, and also for IPCC contributing author before, like really trying to understand the rigor in terms of what's evidence and what's agreement and how confident are we to say certain things. For those people who write, that kind of writing is very different than when you're trying to prove something, like when we're doing like our own writing or reporting on something. But I was involved in the standalone First Nation climate assessment that came out as part of the NRCan climate assessment series. And I think what I would say about that is, in order to answer that question, is there really needs to be involvement of Indigenous people, and not just people like me, not just the scholars. But I think what's really important, and a lot of these kind of processes are leaning towards, is practitioners as well. Like you're trying to really understand what's happening on the ground. Anybody who's an academic, really stuff is like 2 years behind. That's how long it might take to like do the research, publish it, get through peer review. It finally gets out there, somebody finds it, and that becomes the evidence that people use. It's behind what's actually happening. So you need to have practitioners involved. And what I will say is people are not good at it. This is recorded, I guess. IPCC is not very good at that, even though they really want to be. But I think the process that we did for the First Nation, or sorry, the Indigenous Resilience Report was we did have Indigenous practitioner participation in that. So you have to have a broad sense of what that is, including knowledge holders in that process. The other thing you need to have, I found, is you need to have someone who gets it. Um, people call them different things, but someone who's a conduit, someone who understands what's being said and then can figure out what that means in these kind of evidence-based kind of processes. Because I think it's a lot to ask elders and other people to kind of do that work. That's not why they're there. They're there to share, and it's up to people like me or Ali or Stephen and others to kind of work with that. So I do find that that's important. The other thing that I would add is, because I see this all the time and really it drives me nuts, who are Indigenous people in these processes? So a lot of the time we're people that others want to extract knowledge from and then stick it in frameworks, whatever they might be, modeling. Now we have to concern ourselves with AI these days. And when I'm seeing a lot of this kind of writing, like if I'm commenting on it or peer reviewing it in some way, I will see Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, and then it's kind of lumped in with whatever, like a whole list of other things, without recognizing we're talking about people. So I'll just say, you actually need to recognize there's like people behind this, right? So you actually need to work with people. And how are you going to do that? Both Ali and Stephen talked about that, so I won't dwell on that. But I see that a lot, and it drives me bats. So who are Indigenous peoples in these processes? Believe it or not, you have to make the argument that Indigenous peoples can be leaders. They're actors. They have governance. They have rights. They're not just people who suffer from environmental or climate impacts. They do, but that's not the little bubble that you're stuck in for everything. So I do find that's a major issue, and one that I pay a lot of attention to because I've seen it so many times in the different assessments that I've been part of, including Stephen mentioned the continental assessment. What I will add there is that you do look at the evidence a bit differently depending on what you're assessing. So again, the scale of that, but also for that one, I was looking at transboundary. So that's really different than looking at write about risk and vulnerability of Indigenous peoples through the lens of traditional knowledge, and you only have 150 words to do it. That's for North America. That's really hard. That's really hard to do. But in having to do that, what I did find is our current body of evidence, and scholars and scientists hate it when I say this, is hugely biased towards evidence that produced by Western science. And partly because, as I say, 4 decades ago, 3 decades ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, we weren't asking the right questions. We weren't. So we don't have the body of work that we actually need to answer these big questions that were given. However, the knowledge is there. People experience these things all the time. And again, academia tends to be behind what's actually really happening on the ground. So then you need to look at what people call the gray literature. Like I really, quite frankly, privilege a lot of that for anything Indigenous. So if I want to know what's going on and what people actually really think, as opposed to the academic, because it's always behind and usually not done by Indigenous peoples. So then there's lots of questions around, I don't think this is actually co-produced at all, even though you're claiming that. Anyway, that's another story. I have some notes here. So I think, and I'll stop here because there's lots more to say on this question, is I do think people's experience actually really matters. Like it isn't just what people like to look for. Let's get the best practices guide. And I'm like, it's not about the best practices because then people will revert to checklists. It's about using your experience, these relationships that you have, bouncing, like actually talking to humans and, engaging and having these kind of conversations, very transparent. What does this actually kind of really mean? How can we bring that we know something to be true, but maybe it's really hard to actually find the evidence, is a position I find myself in a lot. what evidence can I bring to this to represent this reality that needs to be part of this process. So you need to always have those kind of ongoing relationships and conversations. So I guess to summarize, it's about people. It isn't just about what we see, knowledge, like you could do a search and it'll show up 42 times and I'm like, but you didn't mention people at all or their rights or who they are and what their role is in a lot of these processes. So that's a bit of my experience with this and yeah, happy to continue the conversation around this question. And again, happy to be here and happy that I'm going to look 434 folk. Thank you for joining.
Indeed, indeed. Hey, thanks, Deb, so much. And going back to the process side of things, which is partly what this question is about, I think we need to make these processes much more human. I think that's one of the take-home messages from what you just said. And there's so much work to be done there. All right, we're going to move on to the next question, which is, and I think Deb started to get us a little ways there. What types of environmental evidence does Indigenous knowledge contribute that are often missing from Western sources? I'm going to start with Stephen, then I'm going to go to Deb, and then I'm going to go to Ali. You're also welcome to pass, by the way.
I'm going to defer to Dr. McGregor and Menzies.
Okay, thank you.
Which order would you like that? Me and
let's go to Ali to give you a break then.
Okay. That was a lot of talking there.
Okay. Thanks, Ali.
Well, actually, in Deb's answer to her last question, she actually commented on a lot of the things I was gonna say here, and largely because we're talking about that people part, and I think a lot of the things that Indigenous knowledge can offer is what's kind of stripped away from the science and the scientific literature. It's that like relational information or experiential information or grounded information, as Deb said. It's the stuff that's grounded in what's happening on the land to people that witness it every day. And yeah, I think it's maybe information that the rest of us wish we could or want to include in our science, but is seen as not objective and things like that. But it's really the important piece when we're talking about making decisions at the level of, if we're talking about international climate change policy and things like that, it does need to be grounded in, the consequences and the opportunities and the leadership of people that experience this on the ground. And I think really what it does is it connects data to people and these real world issues that we're making decisions about, as opposed to just using data to make decisions about people in a way that excludes those people. And I think that, the papers that I've been lucky enough to write that have been working with Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous people have been some of my favorite papers I've ever written, because I get to include that piece of, who we are and why this matters and what we hope to do with this information. And that to me has been some of the most fulfilling information or data or knowledge to write about, because it allows that connection to relationships with each other or with, species or place or things like that. And so I think while it's kind of difficult to scale that up in a lot of ways, I think it's really important to try to include that relational and experiential and grounded knowledge in the best ways we can, because that's really what Indigenous knowledge can offer that Western science could if we kind of allowed it to, but it really is what's stripped away from the science when we're supposed to kind of analyze it and interpret it. Yeah, I'll pass to Deb. We have a lot to talk about.
Thanks so much. Over to you, Deb.
Oh yeah, don't get me started on this one. Okay, I love, just because this is where my brain is at the moment and what I'm doing. So I think probably one of the big things about what Indigenous people with their knowledge will bring to these processes is we have basically different priorities. So our questions are going to be different, and the knowledge we want to bring is going to be different. So what I've been finding is that big push, like the big word is like carbon, like that's the big thing in relation to because right now my brain's in climate change. But that's not the big priority of Indigenous people because they're not the ones producing the carbon. Like that's not what they're worried about. It's more like rights and well-being and being able to still be an Indigenous person like my kids and grandchildren. So the priorities, so what's going to be considered evidence, what you're bringing, is going to be different than what state governments might consider to be priority because they've signed international agreements and such. And I saw in the chat too, someone asked a question around funding. So guess what? Though that's what gets funded. So there's going to be a special call for funding, and that's what's going to get funded, right? Um, so like, for example, nature-based solutions. So the way that that was constructed in the big funding calls is so that is not how Indigenous people think about nature-based solutions at all. So it was very, it was kind of hard to, it was kind of hard to like, how am I supposed to bring evidence to the table when how it's even framed in the first place is very different than how Indigenous peoples think about like what is evidence and based on the experience that you're living every day. So I think there's different priorities and different kind of questions that, and you're going to bring different knowledge and evidence to bear because of that. The other is that Indigenous knowledge is not going to be siloed. So the way that research is funded, the way that we study it, it drives me nuts, is it's very siloed. This is monitoring. Adaptation and mitigation never should be allowed to meet. People will discipline you. That's mitigation. That's like they get really upset. So there's all these silos that exist in even in science, ecosystem work, a lot of silos. People are in their disciplines. Indigenous knowledge, I think, brings a reality check to that and just saying this is actually how people or species or our relatives experience whatever it is. So they're breaking down breaking down those silos that we get stuck in and that a lot of the evidence is produced in. The journals that people publish in, anything really like truly interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, really hard to find that actually when you're doing this work. So Indigenous knowledge breaks down some of those barriers or challenges or a lot of those silos because it's very siloed and none of us experience climate change or ecosystem effects in that way. Like we don't. We experience it in the way a human experiences these. We're not experiencing it in the way that people, the scientists tend to study it and how it gets published and how that knowledge is generated. They're making Indigenous knowledge can make links where people don't often see them. They'll make links between something that may not be obvious because again, people are seeing it and living it every day. Like, what does a turtle have to do with the moon? Well, it's actually part of our worldview. So, like, what are the indicators? Like those, so there's going to be, so they're making links that science will miss because again, you're doing your research project on this thing and I'm going to measure this thing and it's going to fit into my model that to do that, you have to ignore other things. Indigenous knowledge doesn't ignore those other things because they matter. I should probably start talking at some point. So I think the other thing that Indigenous knowledge brings to these processes is you really probably most of the funding, in my view, goes towards very technocratic approaches. Like what's the techno solution so that we don't actually have to change our behavior to solve these problems. So Indigenous knowledge brings, I think, humanity to just a technocratic approach to things. Like these are the other things that we need to care about. So it's these other values and knowledge and approaches to that. So it's not so technocratic and only data driven again by what was funded because that's what was important, which a lot of it is decarbonization and innovation being related to that as opposed to how are we going to relate back to the world properly so that we don't cause this big mess in the first place. So I think so Indigenous knowledge brings that in there, brings these other elements into these questions around social justice and environmental justice. And I think it opens a door for others to be able to, like local communities or people of color, to also bring in those conversations. Yeah, I'll stop there. There's a lot that Indigenous knowledge brings to these processes that people aren't trained in how to, again, deal with that or deal with Indigenous people, like as someone pointed out in the chat, it can just be, that's nice, and then ignore it. Been in many meetings like that where it's like, that's nice, and then go on with whatever the agenda is and have no idea how to make sense of what it is that people, that Indigenous peoples and others have shared. Thank you. Hopefully there
Thank
was
you.
some gems in there.
Yes, there are. And when you sort of look at evidence synthesis 101, and it's all focused on having a narrowly defined question, right? Very narrowly defined. And that's really inconsistent with the idea of trying to think holistically. So thank you. I'm going to skip us along, folks, here. I want to move on to a question looking for some examples of successes or partial successes, or maybe on our journey down the road towards synthesizing Indigenous and Western evidence in a way that is meaningful, that is respectful, that has supported environmental decision making. And I'm interested in what about that has made the synthesis successful. So we will start with you, Steve, this time to give you a chance, and then we'll go to Ali and Greg. Sorry, Ali and Deb. I think I said Greg. I'm sorry.
Absolutely. And I'm going to pivot a little bit in just thinking about environmental practice more broadly. And one of the projects I've been involved in is about trying to bring together and look at examples of knowledge bridging in practice. What does that look like? So kind of broadly speaking around what we're focused on here. And so how can we inform kind of those little d decisions that are made by teams, by collaborators, by partnerships? And for us, one of the things that we really focused on was, how do we change the way in which we share the results, the dissemination piece? And this was something that Deb spoke to a bit in terms of the challenges, right? So Ali was talking about the importance of transparency, as well as, and kind of related to that, Deb, in terms of like how we communicate the results, the knowledge. How do we speak to who was involved? How were they involved? And so what we really focused on was, okay, recognizing the importance of place-based context. Context is important. How can we elevate all these different cases where we find knowledge bridging in practice so that we can learn from that? And so to do that, we thought, let's develop a web portal that allows those cases to be in context, allow individuals to learn from the diversity of them, kind of going back to that piece around generalizability and universalism, and create a tool that helps practitioners to engage in more meaningful ways with the diverse approaches. So that was something that we were really grappling with, to try to think differently about how we bring how we think about the mobilization or dissemination, because that can be one of the biggest things. You can have great synthesis, but if you can't bring that to the practitioners, and in our case, this was practitioners who are engaged in collaborative research and monitoring to help change those behaviors, the way in which they approach it, the considerations, the principles, and the practices. And so for us, that was something we really focused on, was trying to think a bit differently about that. I'll pause there.
Thank you very much. Ali.
Yeah, I was trying really hard to think of an example that was at like a high level, but most of the examples I can think of are really in community. Like some of the most successful examples I've seen of synthesizing Indigenous and Western evidence has been examples of working with a community in a place on an issue that matters to them, that helped them make decisions about something. And maybe it's the little d decisions that Steve was talking about. And I think often decision making in that context is forgotten about. We talk about decision makers, and we often think about these nebulous people at a higher level who make decisions But there's a lot of decision making that happens within community that can have huge impacts for people in community. And I think those are some of the examples that come to my mind most easily. I just came back from the Braiding Knowledges Canada knowledge gathering, and there were folks from across the country talking about the things that they're doing within their own communities to, you know, restore relationships with bison or conserve fish or make an IPCA or help moose, which is the work that I'm doing. And um, the positive thinking around science within community is huge. And then the positive thinking of community knowledge is also huge. And so they can come together because there is actual respect for both types of evidence and how those can be used to make decisions. And I think that's again kind of what gets lost when it moves up in the level of decisions we're talking about. And so I think what makes these smaller situations more successful is again the respect for everyone there, for people being present who the decisions affect, for the priorities of those people being at the forefront of decisions that are being made. And so all of these problems or issues that we come to as we make decisions at a broader scale are a lot more present at this community level. And that's where my brain went when I thought of, successful examples. But that's also because that's really what I'm involved in right now, is these kind of community-based monitoring and conservation and management. But there is still this block when it comes to, okay, now what do we do? And we have to make decisions about provincial harvest management or, protected areas and things like that, where it gets removed from that community success. But I'll pass to Deb, who may have more examples of larger scale successes.
Thanks.
It's because I'm old. That's why I just say it. I'm old. Been around a long time. Seen it
Wise.
So I think what comes to mind, like to me, two good examples. Again, I mentioned it already, the Indigenous Resilience Report. That's what we had to do. There were academics around the table, so you're bringing in that knowledge, but we're also conduits. We work with communities, and we know how to work with knowledge, community knowledge, or Indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge that's shared with us, including people's experiences. Sometimes it's like people talking about what their experiences, like this time of year, when should be, for example, I remember this. This is sort of where my brain would go. Someone talking about the impact on food security. Like at one end of the country, the problem was it was too dry and it needed to be more, I don't know, moisture in the air. The other one, it was the opposite. So I'm thinking, oh, is there actually any scientific evidence for that? Like for what people were experiencing, right? And a lot of times there's gaps in the science because those aren't the questions that are important, right, to people. So we would try to find the science, the existing, but and because we're academics, we have access. We don't have the big paywalls that other people might have. We have access to things that other people don't in these kind of contexts. So um, to me, I think we did manage to do it. Again, you always have a word limit that drove me nuts, and then you can't cover everything because you have to decide. It's like that with everything. Like you have to decide the topics that you're going to. So if you read that report, we don't talk much about water, which is like sort of like my big area, because we talked to Indigenous people and they said what was important, and that's what we focused on in that moment. And of course, over time, what's important could change. So it was priorities by First Nations. The questions that they had, where can the science contribute to this assessment? The other place where I've seen it done, although I haven't been involved, but I draw on it a lot, are the tribes' climate assessments. So they also have their standalones. And again, they way bigger in Canada. Like it's actually really hard to assemble these kind of teams in Canada because there just isn't enough of us. And so a lot more Indigenous folk in the US. So they're able to assemble these wonderful teams of people who are scientists and knowledge holders, work with communities. But what I did find that was really distinct and unique about their work, the 2023 and 2025 assessments, is how they framed. So the way we think about fire in Canada is horrible, just terrible. But there they were framing it different because there's a cultural understanding of fire and how you take care of it. So that fire chapter is very different than you would find, let's say, in Canada's Changing Climate Report, primarily dominated by scientists. So I liked how it was coming from a different kind of worldview and understanding that there's a different way. So yeah, it's a problem because of people, but in and of itself, it's actually there's a different understanding and relationship in relation to fire or kin or to water. So I find that those that's what they're doing. They're bringing in that knowledge. And I guess what I've always said in many different spaces is that Indigenous people do this all the time because we have to in communities. My brother was in public works and my sister in health, or people doing the stewardship plan. They're having to synthesize this kind of knowledge all the time. They're listening to community members. They're listening to elders and knowledge holders. Their funding is coming from federal or provincial, and you have to have the science and the evidence. So they're doing this all the time, but they're not studying it and they're not publishing. But they're doing it all the time because you have to. Um, People in Ottawa, wherever the science-based department is, they don't have to all the time. People in the community have to do it all the time. So that is kind of where a lot of it is a lot of it is happening. I think the other thing I'll say, just building upon what Stephen said, is that how do you then mobilize this? So my starting point is always that Indigenous peoples are self-governing, they have governments, they have rights. They want to make good decisions too. This isn't just so everybody else can make good decisions. They're taking care of their communities, they're taking care of the land, they have stewardship responsibilities as well. They want the community to be well. How is this being mobilized for communities? So we try to do that a bit with the climate resilience report, but usually you're just supported to do that kind of work, the synthesis part, the writing part, but not the part that should come after. How do you mobilize this so people can actually use it? Oh, my
Fantastic.
laptop is exacting up. Hopefully, I don't even know if you're still there or not. But anyway,
No,
I might
we
be this
are, and
discombobulated voice. Yeah. Okay, you can still see me. This discombobulated. I don't know what it's doing. Oh, this is not the time to do that. So I will say. So that's what I also wanted to say is that yeah, Indigenous peoples are doing this all the time, and how we frame things. Um, is different. Like we don't see disaster in the same way that I think most people do. And I'm just going to sign off here, or not sign off, but I don't know what's going on here. This is I'm trying to be fancy by using a big monitor. That's why I'm just like, where should I be looking at the little red dot or like at the screen? But anyway, I'll
we can still hear you and we can still see you. So thank
okay,
you.
okay. I'm just
Right.
seeing a black screen and I'm like, I'm just this disembodied voice just talking to people. Anyway, I'll stop there. There's lots more to say, but hopefully there was again something in there that was insightful.
For sure. I'm going to go to a question that came from one of the folks that's participating as an audience member. I think it's a really fascinating question. In Canada, we're in a moment right now where there's need for these sort of nation building projects, so big infrastructure projects, and with that comes there's environmental costs, there's social costs, cultural costs, and so on. But these are happening rather quickly. They're functionally being fast tracked. And so the question is about how do we, and the expectation in the past is that Indigenous knowledge systems and worldviews need to bend to these Western processes and timelines and so on. How do we flip that narrative so that the Western processes are bending to better accommodate Indigenous worldviews and knowledge systems and processes? So, in the context of that fast tracking development question in Canada, anyone brave enough to tackle that one?
I'll tackle an angle of it,
Please.
which is I think there's an interesting, well, important intersection here. The moment we're at, coupled though with one of the things I've been thinking deeply about, right, is how do we transform how Western science is done? And when we reflect on theories of scientific revolution, I'm reminded that science in and of itself, Western science, is a very conservative endeavor. It's about like minor changes, slow changes in how we do things. And so to bring forward transformation in how we do collaborative research and monitoring and think about these Western colonial institutions. It's both about changing hearts and minds and understanding the damages done, but it also requires very much like a systems lens and unpacking, not just we're focusing on people. How do we change people, develop cultural humility, but how do we, change the practices, the procedures, and the policies? And sometimes we get caught up on just one of those. Say, oh, we change people, or we need a new policy. But then there's all these other pieces that are part of it, right? These procedures. How do we fund? How do this is something that Deb put out. Who and what is funded? Even within that, there's all sorts of procedures that can make it incredibly difficult to receive the funding or to spend the funding or to report on the funding. So really taking a holistic and systemic approach to thinking about, not just people and policies, but also practices, procedures, program design. Those all need to be taken into consideration to move towards doing things differently, doing them in a good way that elevate self-determination and Indigenous sovereignty and a recognition of multiple ways of knowing in doing these processes. So I think it's another big thing for us to think about, because it's very easy to focus on one or the other, but not think kind of systemically about science as a whole and the process of doing it. Here we're talking about evidence synthesis. We talked about process, but there's all sorts of procedures, there's protocols. How do we transform each of those pieces collectively to be more inclusive?
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate that. And I should just want to give a shout out. It was Kimley Thompson who brought that question to us. So thanks. Deb, Ali, would either of you like to jump in on this one? And I'm going to ask for fairly short responses. I just want to be able to fire in one quick wrap-up question after this. Deb, I see you're off mute, so we'll go to you next.
Yes, I'll be quick with this. I think you are starting to see this, and the trick here is that it should be Indigenous led. So for example, the Indigenous-led environmental assessment processes, I did a project with Chiefs of Ontario on that. Like, how do you frame this in terms of Indigenous laws and Indigenous knowledge, like not like environmental assessment the way it's written up in the legislation or the act. So I think there are communities who are starting to do that. Same with cumulative effects. That's some of the work that Lawrence Ignace is working on. Literally, you do have to transform, and it is going to look different. But I think because there aren't like these, they're not established. I don't think well established in Western science either. Like, how do you do it? This is where Indigenous, I think, people can take the leadership. Like, this is how it could be done. Like, not the other way where you're like, that's not obviously not protecting the environment very well because things are getting worse and not better. So I think that that makes a difference in those kind of processes, and they are happening. The other thing I'll say is we need different kind of frameworks for how we work together. So way back in the day, like what people wanted to do is let's integrate, and then it turned out to be assimilation and extraction. And now there's the two I'd seeing braiding knowledges, weaving knowledge. Like there's all these different now co-production, diversity knowledge. So people know that there's a problem, and they're trying to find ways to figure out how to do this. So I think I would just say you have to be really open and like support Indigenous leadership to succeed, not just have people at a table and then you convene them once in a while and then you're gone. Like that's not Indigenous people leading a process. I'll stop there just to try to be quick.
Thanks, Deb. And Ali, anything further to add?
No, I was going to say if anyone has an answer, it would solve a lot of my daily conflicts in my head. So
Understood.
yeah.
Understood. Cool. All right. So we're going to go to our last question. We've got about 4 minutes left. So I'm looking for about a minute each from our panelists. What should future evidence synthesis projects prioritize to better support Indigenous self-determination in environmental governance? Ali, we're going to start with you, then we'll go to Steve, and then to Deb.
Yeah, I think just people being present. Indigenous led requires Indigenous people being present, and having people who know how to work with Indigenous knowledge need to be there, as Deb said, or people who can kind of translate. and Indigenous priorities. And, Deb also said Indigenous people have different priorities because of the consequences of these things on their lives, but also survival and things like that. And so I think prioritizing people being present, not just their knowledge, and priorities of the Indigenous communities when thinking about what we're synthesizing this evidence for. That would be my very quick answer, and I'll pass it along.
I appreciate that. Stephen, over to you.
For me, adding on to Ali around centering peoples and partnerships, and really working to change the process, focusing on transparency and thinking about whose priorities are and how are they supporting those priorities. And to Deb, how are we getting that information back to communities?
Thanks, Stephen. And Deb.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. I think for me the main thing with the question is really being able to, because a lot of these are usually big teams of people, and often Indigenous people aren't supported to be able to do their own evidence synthesis. I've seen it, but not very often. So I think that needs to happen, and then it's available, right? Instead of you can move away from the extraction mode of doing things, or the one-off kind of stuff that tends to happen. So I think Indigenous folks, and they would, they would work with scientists. They do all the time, and they've been doing it forever. It's not like you're excluded from the process. You would be there to work with this with communities. And I think as a person who's been on some of these teams that have been assembled, there's a lot of rules, a lot of confidentiality around some of the things when you're writing. I think what's important is you need to be able to go back and ground truth. You need to be able to go back and say, is this even making sense? Because sometimes you need to have those conversations. On one of the ones I'm on now, there's only 2 Indigenous scholars. We're the only 2 can have conversations around. Did you notice like innovation tends to be all about carbon, which isn't really kind of what I'm seeing in the literature with Indigenous people? Like you need people to talk to about what's making sense and what you're seeing. So there needs to be this opportunity to go back and like make sure we're ground truthing that with communities and other people who are not necessarily, who aren't part of those processes for they're very intense processes. And every time I'm in them, I'm like, why did I agree to do this? But then like someone needs to be there to ask those kind of uncomfortable questions. So I will stop there. There needs to be Indigenous led so they can do this work, and then it's available because they're happy to share it. They want to influence decision making. They're happy to share it. But there also needs to be, when they're not led by Indigenous people, there needs to be that ground truthing going on to make sure that we're on top of it and we're getting it. Hopefully that was short.
It was, and I'm just so grateful to all of you. This certainly has me thinking, and I think all of us, all the 400 plus folks that tuned in today, there's a lot to think about here. There's a lot more conversations to be had. We really need to be rethinking about our processes that are currently set up to be, fairly extractive and exclusionary. We need to be thinking about transparency, how to be more relational, centering people, and being more holistic. And we need to keep the conversation going. There's a lot to do, and there's roles and space for all of us to be part of that solution as we work to think about ways to do this in a good way. On behalf of the 400 or so attendees, I'd like to thank the 3 panelists, Dr. Deborah McGregor, Dr. Stephen Alexander, and Dr. Alison Menzies. I'd also like to thank all of you, the 400 plus folks that tuned in. Thanks for spending some of your morning, afternoon, or evening with us. We're certainly grateful. And with that, we'll wrap things up and wish everybody a fantastic day. Thanks so much.